The vault door groaned as 17-year-old Daniel pressed his trembling hand against the scanner. The millionaire who'd mocked him for weeks stood frozen, his face draining of color as the supposedly impossible happened. The security system accepted Daniel's fingerprint. Inside that vault lay documents that would prove Daniel wasn't the fraud everyone believed him to be. But as the mechanism clicked and whirred, one question burned in everyone's mind. How could a disabled teenager from nowhere have access to a vault that only the family's true heirs should be able to open? 2 days earlier, Daniel had stepped off the bus at Riverside Heights with nothing but a worn backpack and a letter he'd carried for 3 months. His cerebral palsy made his gait uneven. His left hand curled slightly inward, but his eyes were sharp as they took in the gleaming towers of the Ashford Financial District. Somewhere in this neighborhood of old money and older secrets was the grandfather he'd never met, the man his mother had spoken of in whispers during her final days. The letter felt heavy in his pocket, not because of its physical weight, but because of what it promised. His mother, Margaret, had died of cancer 6 months ago, leaving Daniel with foster care papers and a confession that changed everything. She'd written that his grandfather, Thomas Ashford, was one of the wealthiest men in the city, that Daniel was the legitimate heir to the Ashford fortune, and that she'd been forced to keep this secret for 17 years. The letter contained an address, a name, and a desperate wish that Daniel would find a family she'd been denied. Daniel understood fear. He'd lived with it every day in the group home, where older kids took his belongings and staff looked through him like he was furniture. He'd learned to keep his head down, to expect nothing, to trust no one. But standing outside the iron gates of the Ashford estate, looking up at the mansion that could have been his home, he felt a different kind of fear, the fear of hope. He pressed the intercom button. "Delivery entrance is around back," a crisp voice said. "I'm not a delivery person. My name is Daniel Torres. I need to speak with Thomas Ashford. It's about his daughter, Margaret." The pause that followed was long enough for Daniel to wonder if they'd simply disconnected. Then, wait there. 20 minutes later, a man in an expensive suit emerged from the house, flanked by 2 security guards. This wasn't Thomas Ashford. Daniel had seen photos. This man was younger, maybe 40, with the kind of tan that came from yacht clubs and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm Richard Ashford, Thomas's nephew and the estate manager," the man said, looking Daniel up and down with barely concealed disgust. "What's this about Margaret?" Daniel pulled out the letter, his hand shaking slightly. "She was my mother. She died 6 months ago. Before she passed, she told me that Thomas Ashford is my grandfather, and she gave me this letter to prove it." Richard took the letter, scanning it quickly, his expression hardening. "This is a photocopy. Where's the original?" "That is the original. No letterhead, no signature, just some story about a secret daughter?" Richard's laugh was cold. "Do you know how many people try this? My uncle is a wealthy man. Every few months, someone shows up claiming to be a long-lost relative." He handed the letter back. "You should leave before we call the police." But Daniel had expected this. His mother had warned him they'd try to turn him away. She knew things. Personal things. She told me about the music box with the blue bird. She told me about the scar on his left shoulder from the sailing accident when he was 12. She told me about the study with the green leather chairs and the painting of the lighthouse. Something flickered in Richard's eyes, surprise, then calculation. Anyone could have learned those details. Servants talk. My uncle has been in the public eye for 40 years. She told me about what he whispered to her every night before bed when she was little. "Sleep tight, little thunder." Daniel's voice cracked. She said that was their secret name, because when she was born during a storm, she came out crying so loud it sounded like thunder. The color drained from Richard's face. That detail wasn't public knowledge. It couldn't be. For a moment, he looked genuinely rattled, and Daniel felt a surge of hope. But then Richard's expression hardened again, like shutters closing. "Very clever. I don't know who fed you that information, but the answer is no. Mr. Ashford sees no one without an appointment, and you won't be getting one." Richard turned to the guards. "Escort this young man off the property. If he returns, have him arrested for trespassing." "Please," Daniel said as the guards approached. "I have nowhere else to go. I just want to meet him. I just want him to know his daughter thought about him every day until she died." Richard paused at the gate, looking back with something that might have been genuine regret, or a perfect imitation of it. "Whatever Margaret told you, whatever she believed, Thomas Ashford has only one child. My cousin, Victoria. She's his sole heir, and she's all the family he needs. I'm sorry for your situation, but you're chasing a fantasy." The gates closed with a decisive clang. Daniel stood there as the sun began to set, staring at the mansion, where somewhere inside was a man who might be his grandfather. A man who didn't know he existed. Or worse, a man who knew and didn't care. He found a bench in the park across the street and sat down, trying to figure out what to do next. The group home wouldn't take him back. He'd aged out. The foster coordinator had made it clear this was his last chance before he was on his own completely. He had $200 in his pocket, a backpack of clothes, and a truth that no one wanted to hear. That's when he noticed the old man. He was sitting 3 benches down, feeding pigeons from a bag of breadcrumbs. There was something familiar about his profile, the slope of his shoulders, the silver hair. Daniel pulled out his phone and looked again at the photo his mother had kept hidden, a decades-old picture of a young Thomas Ashford holding a little girl. It was him. Daniel's heart hammered. He stood up, then sat back down. What was he supposed to do? Walk up and announce himself? The man's own nephew had just turned him away. But this might be his only chance. He was still debating when the old man spoke, without looking at him. "You've been staring at me for 5 minutes. Either you're planning to rob me, or you want to say something." The voice was rough but not unkind. Daniel swallowed hard. "Mr. Ashford? That depends on who's asking. My name is Daniel Torres. I came to your gate earlier, but your nephew turned me away." Now the old man looked at him directly, and Daniel saw sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "Richard mentioned a boy with a story about Margaret. Said he was trying to scam me." "It's not a scam. She was my mother." Thomas Ashford studied him for a long moment. "Margaret died 34 years ago. Car accident. She was 8 years old." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. That's what you were told." "That's what happened. I saw her grave." "Then someone lied to you." Daniel's voice was shaking now. "Because she died 6 months ago in Portland, Oregon, and before she did, she told me everything. She told me you were her father, that someone made her disappear, that you thought she was dead. She told me to find you." Thomas's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened on the bread bag. "Why would anyone do that?" "I don't know. She wouldn't tell me the whole story. She said it wasn't safe, that I had to be careful, that there were people who would." Daniel trailed off, suddenly aware of how paranoid it sounded. Who would what? Who would want to keep the truth hidden? Who had something to gain from her staying gone? Thomas was silent for a long time. Then he said, "If you're running a con, it's an elaborate one. If you're not." He stood up slowly, leaning on a cane Daniel hadn't noticed. "There's a diner 2 blocks north. Meet me there in 30 minutes. Come alone, and bring whatever proof you have." He walked away before Daniel could respond. Daniel sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Then he grabbed his backpack and hurried toward the diner, his mind racing. This was it. This was his chance. But something nagged at him. The way Richard had reacted to the little thunder detail, the way Thomas's hand had tightened. Someone had convinced this man his daughter was dead and had maintained that lie for over 30 years. Someone who had access, who had control, who could forge documents and arrange a grave. Someone who stood to lose everything if the truth came out. The diner was nearly empty when Daniel arrived. Thomas was already there, sitting in a back booth with a cup of coffee. He gestured for Daniel to sit. "Show me what you have." Daniel pulled out the letter, a few photographs, and his mother's old bracelet, a delicate silver chain with a small charm in the shape of a lightning bolt. "She wore this every day. She said you gave it to her for her 7th birthday. She said you had it made special because of the Thunder nickname." Thomas reached for the bracelet with a hand that trembled slightly. He turned it over, examining the clasp, and Daniel saw something break in his expression. "There's an engraving on the inside of the charm," Thomas said quietly. "Her initials and mine. MA plus TA. I had the jeweler put it there so she'd know she always carried a piece of me with her. He looked up at Daniel. How did you get this? She gave it to me before she died. She made me promise I'd show it to you. Thomas set the bracelet down carefully, as if it might shatter. Tell me about her. Everything. So Daniel did. He told him about the woman who'd raised him alone, who'd worked 2 jobs to keep them fed, who'd never talked about her past, but would sometimes stare at old photographs with tears in her eyes. He told him about the cancer, about the final weeks when she'd finally broken her silence, about the confusion and anger and desperate hope that had brought him here. She said she loved you. Daniel finished. She said she forgave you for not finding her, because she knew you tried. She said she wanted you to know she became a good person despite everything, and that she hoped you'd help me become one too. Thomas's eyes were wet. I searched for 2 years. After the accident, they told me her body was identified, that the car fire had been severe, but the dental records matched. I buried what I thought were her remains. I visited that grave every week for a decade. His voice hardened. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to make me believe she was dead. Who would do that? Someone who wanted control of my estate. Someone who needed Margaret gone to secure their own position. Thomas leaned back. When Margaret disappeared, when I thought she died, my brother James had just died 6 months earlier. I was devastated, not thinking clearly. The family lawyers drew up new documents. Richard, James's son, became my primary advisor. His sister Victoria was named my sole heir. At the time, it made sense. I had no other children, no other close family. But if Margaret was alive, then she would have been my heir. Everything would have been hers, and eventually yours. Thomas's expression darkened. Richard has managed my affairs for 30 years. He controls every financial decision, every investment, every expense. If Margaret came back, he'd lose everything. Daniel felt cold. He knows, doesn't he? That's why he turned me away so quickly. He knows I'm telling the truth. Or suspects it strongly enough to be afraid. Thomas pulled out his phone. I'm going to call my personal attorney. Not the firm Richard uses, someone independent. We'll need DNA testing, document verification, investigation into what happened 30 years ago. Will that be enough? If Richard has been in control this long, won't he try to stop it? Thomas smiled grimly. Let him try. I may be old, but I'm not powerless yet. And if what you're telling me is true, if my daughter really lived all those years thinking I'd abandoned her. His voice broke. Then I owe it to her memory to make this right. But before he could make the call, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned. Richard, he's asking where I am. Says I missed a medication dose. He looked at Daniel. I need to go back. The estate has medical staff. I have a heart condition. But tomorrow, come to the house at 10. I'll have my attorney there, and we'll start the process properly. Use the main entrance this time. He stood to leave, then paused. Daniel, what was your mother like? Was she happy? Daniel thought about it carefully. Not always, but she tried to be. She used to say that happiness was something you built in small moments, not something that just happened to you. She'd make hot chocolate on bad days, and we'd play cards, and she'd tell me stories about rainstorms and adventures. She never told me they were memories. Thomas nodded slowly. She learned that from her mother, my wife, Catherine. She died when Margaret was 6. Car accident, but a real one. He touched the bracelet one more time. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. And Daniel, be careful. If I'm right about Richard, he's had 30 years to build his position. He won't give it up easily. Daniel watched him leave, feeling both elated and terrified. He'd found his grandfather. The man believed him. But now came the dangerous part, proving the truth to everyone else, while someone who had everything to lose was watching. He spent that night in a youth shelter, lying awake on a narrow cot, running through scenarios in his head. Every noise made him jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. His mother's warnings echoed in his mind. Be careful. Trust no one until you know who your real allies are. At 9:30 the next morning, Daniel stood outside the Ashford estate again, but this time the gates opened for him. A different person met him at the door. an older woman with kind eyes who introduced herself as Grace, the head housekeeper. "Mr. Ashford is waiting for you in the study," she said, leading him through marble halls and past rooms filled with art and history. "He's been up since 5. Haven't seen him this energized in years." The study was exactly as his mother had described it: green leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and the painting of the lighthouse over the fireplace. Thomas sat in one of the chairs, looking more vibrant than he had the night before. Next to him was a woman in her 50s, with intelligent eyes and a briefcase. "Daniel, this is Marion Brooks, my personal attorney. She's someone I've known since before Richard took over managing my affairs. I trust her completely." Marion shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Ashford has told me your story. I've already begun preliminary research into the accident report from 34 years ago and the death certificate filed for Margaret Ashford. I have to tell you, there are some irregularities that should have been caught at the time." "What kind of irregularities?" Daniel asked. "The dental records used for identification came from a dentist who retired 6 months before the accident and whose office records were destroyed in a fire shortly after. The body was cremated quickly, within 48 hours, which was unusual for that time period. And the police report was filed by an officer who was later dismissed for falsifying evidence in other cases." Thomas's jaw tightened. Someone paid to make this look legitimate. "That's my suspicion," Marion agreed. "But we'll need more than suspicion. We'll need DNA evidence linking Daniel to you. We'll need to verify Margaret's life history in Portland, and ideally, we need to understand who orchestrated her disappearance and why." "How long will that take?" Daniel asked. "The DNA test can be done today, and we'll have results in a week. The investigation will take longer." Marion pulled out a tablet. "In the meantime, I need to collect as much information from you as possible. Birth certificate, your mother's records, photographs, anything that can help us build a timeline." They spent the next 2 hours going through everything. Daniel told them about the apartment in Portland where he'd grown up, about the schools he'd attended, about his mother's jobs. He showed them the few documents she'd kept: his birth certificate listing Margaret Torres as his mother and father unknown, report cards, medical records showing his cerebral palsy diagnosis. "Did your mother ever mention how she ended up in Portland?" Marion asked. "She said someone helped her, a woman named Alice. She didn't give me a last name, but she said Alice found her after the accident, gave her a new identity, helped her start over." "Why would this Alice person do that?" "Mom said Alice had her own reasons for hating the people who'd hurt her. She said Alice wanted to protect her from them." Thomas leaned forward. "Did your mother ever say specifically who them was?" Daniel hesitated. She was scared to name names, but near the end, when the pain medication made her confused, she'd sometimes talk about a man with cold eyes who'd told her she had to disappear or something bad would happen to her father. She said he promised that if she stayed gone, you'd be safe. The room went silent. "Someone threatened her," Thomas said flatly. "Someone made her think that by disappearing, she was protecting me. Which means whoever did this had access to an 8-year-old child, had the ability to forge documents and arrange a fake death, and had enough power to maintain that secret for decades," Marion said. "That's not a small operation. That requires resources, connections, and sustained control." Daniel saw where this was going. Richard was only 12 years old when this happened," Marion said carefully. "But his father, James, was Thomas's business partner. James would have had access, opportunity, and motive. With Margaret gone, his own children would stand to inherit." "James was my brother," Thomas said. "He wouldn't have." But he stopped, uncertainty crossing his face. "Would he?" "James died 31 years ago," Marion said. "But his children have benefited enormously from Margaret's absence. Victoria is currently listed as sole heir to an estate worth roughly $3 billion. Richard has drawn a substantial salary for 30 years as estate manager, and he controls several investment accounts that give him significant financial leverage." Before anyone could respond, the study door opened and Richard walked in, his expression carefully neutral. "Grace said we had a visitor. I wanted to welcome Daniel properly this time and apologize for yesterday's misunderstanding. The change in his tone was dramatic. Yesterday he'd been hostile, dismissive. Now he was all smooth concern. "Richard," Thomas said coldly, "we're in the middle of a private meeting." "Of course, Uncle. I just wanted to make sure our guest was comfortable. I've instructed the kitchen to prepare lunch." He smiled at Daniel, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've also taken the liberty of consulting with our family attorneys about your claims. They've advised that we proceed carefully. There are legal protocols for situations like this." "Marion is handling the legal protocols," Thomas said. "Marion left the firm 20 years ago," Richard said smoothly. "I'm not sure she's current on estate law. Perhaps we should involve Goldstein and Associates. They've represented the family for decades." "The same firm that prepared all the documents after Margaret's death?" Marion said pointedly. "The firm that your father used?" "No, thank you. We'll keep this independent." Richard's smile tightened. "I'm only trying to protect my uncle's interests. You have to understand, we've dealt with fraudulent claims before. It's not personal." "Actually," Marion said, "I think it's very personal. I've spent the morning reviewing documents, and I have some questions about the timeline of Margaret's disappearance. Questions about who had access to her medical records, who arranged for the dental comparison, who pushed for immediate cremation. That was 30 years ago. I was a child. But your father wasn't, and you've had access to all his files for 3 decades." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Richard's expression hardened. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm saying that if Daniel's claims are true, someone in this family conspired to fake Margaret's death. Someone who benefited from that lie. And that person, or their children, might have reasons to want Daniel to go away." Richard looked at Thomas. "Uncle, you can't possibly be entertaining this. Look at him. He shows up with some stories his mother told him. A bracelet that could have been bought anywhere. And suddenly he's your grandson? He could have done 5 minutes of research online." "He knew about Little Thunder," Thomas said quietly. Richard froze. "That was our private name. Margaret and mine. I never told anyone. Not James, not you, not Victoria. The only way Daniel could know that is if Margaret told him. Or if someone who overheard it years ago told him. A servant, perhaps. Or, the servants didn't know." Thomas cut him off. "It was just ours. Which means either you're lying about how he could have learned it, or you're admitting you've been lying about something else." The mask slipped for just a moment, and Daniel saw something dangerous in Richard's eyes. But then he recovered, holding up his hands in surrender. "Fine. I can see you've made up your mind. Do the DNA test. Investigate all you want. But when this falls apart, and it will, remember that I tried to protect you from this disappointment." He turned to Daniel. "I hope you're prepared for what happens when the truth comes out, whatever that truth is." He left, closing the door with exaggerated gentleness. And this is where everything shifted, because now it wasn't just about Daniel finding his grandfather. It was about proving a truth that someone had buried for 3 decades, and staying alive long enough to see it come to light. Marion pulled out a DNA testing kit from her briefcase. "We should do this now, while we're all together. The lab I use is independent and expedited. We'll have results in 5 to 7 days." The swab was quick and painless. Marion packaged everything carefully, labeled it, and promised to courier it to the lab personally that afternoon. "Don't trust anyone else with this," she said. "And Thomas, I'd recommend increasing your personal security. If my suspicions are correct, this is about to get complicated." Thomas nodded. "Daniel, I'd like you to stay here at the estate. We have plenty of guest rooms, and frankly, I'd feel better knowing where you are." "Is that safe?" "If Richard lives in the West Wing with Victoria. You'll be in the East Wing, near my rooms. Grace and Marcus have been with me for 40 years. They're loyal to me, not to Richard." Thomas smiled. "Besides, I want to get to know you. Whether or not the DNA confirms what I already believe in my heart, you knew my daughter. You were raised by her. You're the closest thing to her I'll ever have again." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "She told me stories about you. About teaching her to sail. about the way you'd sneak her cookies before dinner, about how you'd read her adventure books and do all the voices. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. Did she remember being happy? Before everything. She said those were the best years of her life. She said she'd dream about them and wake up thinking it was real, and then remember it was gone. She said the hardest part wasn't losing you. It was knowing you thought she was dead, that you'd mourned her, that she couldn't even tell you she was alive. Why didn't she come back? As an adult, why didn't she try? She said she was afraid, that whoever had made her disappear was still out there, still powerful, and that coming back would put both of you in danger. She said she'd rather live with you thinking she was dead than risk actually getting you killed. Daniel's voice cracked. She loved you. She never stopped loving you. Thomas stood abruptly and pulled Daniel into a tight embrace. The old man was shaking, and Daniel realized he was crying, deep, wrenching sobs that sounded like they'd been locked away for 30 years. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't find you. I'm sorry she had to live like that. I'm sorry for all of it." Daniel hugged him back, his own tears falling. For the first time since his mother's death, he didn't feel alone. Marion gave them a moment, then cleared her throat gently. "I hate to interrupt, but we need to discuss safety protocols. Thomas, I want you to document everything. Every conversation with Richard, every decision about the estate, every detail of Daniel's claims. If something happens to either of you, there needs to be a clear record." "You think he'd actually hurt us?" Daniel asked. "I think we're talking about billions of dollars and a lifetime of positioning," Marion said bluntly. "People have done worse for less. Until we have proof and legal protection in place, assume you're both at risk." They spent the rest of the day establishing a plan. Marion would investigate the old accident report and track down anyone who'd been involved with Margaret's case. Thomas would review his estate documents and finances, looking for anything irregular. And Daniel would stay close, stay alert, and most importantly, stay alive. That evening, Grace showed Daniel to his room, a spacious suite with a view of the gardens and furnishings that probably cost more than his mother had earned in a year. It felt wrong somehow, to be here in luxury while she'd struggled in that tiny apartment. But she'd wanted this for him. She'd sent him here. He was unpacking his meager belongings when there was a knock on the door. He opened it to find a young woman about his age, with dark hair and Thomas's blue eyes. "You must be Daniel," she said. Her tone was neutral, unreadable. "I'm Victoria, Richard's sister." Daniel's guard went up immediately. "Hi. Can I come in? I promise I'm not here to interrogate you or threaten you. I wanted to meet the person who's turning our family upside down." Daniel hesitated, then stepped aside. Victoria entered, looking around the room with an expression he couldn't quite read. "My father used to tell me stories about Aunt Margaret," she said. "I was born after she died, so I never knew her. But he'd talk about her sometimes, about how bright she was, how much Uncle Thomas loved her." She turned to face Daniel. "Do you really think she's your mother?" "I know she is. But do you understand what that means? If you're right, then someone in my family, someone I love, lied and manipulated and destroyed lives. And if you're wrong, then you're causing pain for nothing." "I'm not wrong." Victoria studied him for a long moment. "Richard is terrified. I've never seen him like this. He's making phone calls, pulling files, acting like the world is ending." She paused. "He says you're a con artist, but I don't think you are." "Why not?" "Because a con artist would be smoother. You're scared and grieving, and way out of your depth. That's not how you'd play it if this were a scam." She sat down on the edge of the bed. "I've been groomed my whole life to take over the Ashford legacy. I've studied business, law, philanthropy. I've built relationships and proven myself. If you're Thomas's grandson, I lose all of that." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I didn't ask for it either." She looked at him directly. "But I need to know, are you after the money? Because if you are, there are ways to settle this without destroying everything. We could come to an arrangement." "I don't want money. I want family. I want to know where I came from. Daniel's voice broke. "I just want to not be alone anymore." Victoria's expression softened. That I actually believe. She stood. My brother thinks you're dangerous. I think you're just a kid who lost his mother and is looking for answers. But either way, be careful. Richard isn't the only one with something to lose, and not everyone plays fair. She left, and Daniel sat there trying to figure out if that had been a warning or a threat. The next few days fell into an uneasy pattern. Thomas introduced Daniel to the staff, showed him around the estate, shared stories about Margaret's childhood. They looked through old photo albums, and Daniel saw his mother's face smiling from page after page. A little girl who'd had no idea what was coming. Richard kept his distance, but Daniel would catch him watching sometimes, his expression calculating. Victoria was friendlier, stopping by to chat, asking questions about his life in Portland. Daniel couldn't tell if she was genuinely curious or gathering information. Marion called daily with updates. She'd found the detective who'd worked Margaret's case. He was retired but willing to talk. She'd located the fire marshal's report on the dentist office fire. It had been ruled suspicious, but never fully investigated. And she tracked down several people who'd worked at the estate 30 years ago, including a groundskeeper who remembered something strange about the day Margaret disappeared. He said there was a woman who visited that day. Marion told them over speakerphone. Someone he'd never seen before. She met with James Ashford privately, and later that evening, Margaret was gone. He thought it was odd at the time, but didn't connect it to anything. Did he remember what she looked like? Thomas asked. Older, well-dressed, professional. He got the impression she was some kind of specialist, lawyer or consultant maybe. Daniel's breath caught. Alice. That has to be Alice. The woman my mother said helped her disappear. If we can find this Alice, Marion said, we might be able to get the full story. But it's been 30 years. That's a long time for someone to stay hidden. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about his mother as that little girl, scared and confused, being told she had to leave everything behind. Had she understood what was happening? Had she tried to fight it? Or had she believed she was protecting her father? He was staring at the ceiling when he heard a noise in the hallway. Footsteps, too quiet to be casual. His door was locked, but the footsteps paused right outside. Daniel held his breath. Then his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Garden Gate. 5 minutes. Come alone. A friend. Every instinct told him not to go. But what if it was someone with information? What if it was Alice? He pulled on his shoes and slipped out of his room, moving as quietly as he could through the darkened house. The garden gate was at the far end of the east wing, partially hidden by rose bushes. When he reached it, he found it unlocked. A figure stood in the shadows beyond, a woman older with silver hair. Daniel Torres, she said. You look like her. Same eyes, same stubborn chin. Who are you? Someone who's been waiting 34 years for this day. I'm Alice Brennan. I was the one who helped your mother disappear. Daniel's heart raced. Why? Why did you do it? Because James Ashford paid me to, and because I thought I was saving a little girl's life. Alice stepped into the moonlight, and Daniel could see the regret etched into her face. I was a family lawyer back then, specializing in custody cases. James came to me with a problem. His brother was about to remarry, and James was afraid the new wife would influence Thomas to cut James out of the business. With Margaret alive, James's children would never inherit, so he needed Margaret gone. He wanted her killed. No, James wasn't a murderer, just a ruthlessly practical man. He wanted her disappeared in a way that looked like an accident, in a way that would break Thomas's heart, but wouldn't be murder. He told me Thomas was planning to send Margaret to boarding school in Europe, that the new wife was already alienating her, that Margaret would be better off starting fresh somewhere else. That was a lie. I know that now, but I was young and ambitious, and James paid me very well. I arranged everything, the fake accident, the false dental records, the quick cremation. I found a couple in Portland who'd lost their daughter and were desperate for another. I told them Margaret was from an abusive situation and needed a fresh start. They agreed to take her, change her name, raise her as their own. But they didn't. No, they took the money and abandoned her after 6 months. By the time I found out, Margaret had been placed in foster care. I tried to fix it, tried to find her a real home, but the system kept moving her around. I lost track of her for years. Alice's voice broke. I told myself she was better off away from the Ashfords, that at least she was alive. But the truth is, I destroyed that little girl's life for money. Why are you telling me this now? Because James is dead and I'm dying. Cancer, same as your mother. I have maybe 3 months left, and I don't want to die with this secret. She pulled out an envelope. This is a full confession. Everything I did, everyone involved, all the documents I forged. It's notarized and witnessed. Give it to Thomas. Tell him I'm sorry. Daniel took the envelope with shaking hands. Did Richard know? Victoria. Richard was just a boy. But after James died, Richard found his father's papers, including records of payments to me. He's known for years what his father did. He's been maintaining the lie because exposing it would mean losing everything. He threatened me. He tried to make my grandfather think I was a con artist. He'll do worse if he gets desperate. Be careful, Daniel. You're fighting for something Richard has spent his entire adult life protecting. Alice turned to go, then paused. Your mother was supposed to have a better life. That was supposed to be the trade-off. She'd lose her father, but she'd have everything else. Instead, she got poverty and hardship and a son she had to raise alone. I'm sorrier than you can possibly know. She disappeared into the darkness before Daniel could respond. He stood there clutching the envelope, his mind reeling. This was it, the proof they needed. Alice's confession would expose everything, would vindicate his mother, would secure his place in the family. But it would also destroy Richard and Victoria's understanding of their father. It would shatter the lie they'd built their lives on. Daniel made his way back to the house, his hand on the envelope in his pocket. He'd tell Thomas in the morning. They'd give it to Marion, and she'd use it too. The lights flicked on. Richard stood in the hallway, blocking Daniel's path. Going somewhere? I couldn't sleep. I was walking in the garden. At 3 in the morning. Alone. Through the back gate. Richard's voice was soft, dangerous. Want to try again? I don't have to explain myself to you. No, but you do have to think about consequences. You've been here less than a week, and already you're sneaking around, meeting with people, collecting evidence for your little story. Richard took a step closer. Do you know what I think? I think you're working with someone. Someone who's using you to get to my uncle's money. You know that's not true. Do I? Richard smiled coldly. Because from where I'm standing, you're the one who showed up out of nowhere with just enough information to be believable. You're the one who's convinced a lonely old man that his dead daughter somehow survived. You're the one who stands to inherit billions. The DNA test will prove. The DNA test will prove you're related to someone. But that doesn't mean you're who you claim to be. There are other explanations. Margaret could have had other children before you. She could have given a child up for adoption. You could be her grandson, not her son. You could be related to Thomas through an entirely different line. Richard's voice took on a persuasive tone. Why put everyone through this? Why tear the family apart? Take a settlement. Take $10 million and disappear. Start a real life, not one built on fairy tales. You want me gone because I'm telling the truth. I want you gone because you're chaos. Whether you're right or wrong doesn't matter. The damage is already done. Thomas is obsessing over the past instead of taking care of his health. Victoria is questioning everything she's worked for. The estate is vulnerable to challenges and lawsuits. All because of you. Daniel pulled out the envelope. Alice Brennan confessed. She told me everything. How your father paid her to fake my mother's death. How she arranged it all. How you found his records and have been covering it up for years. Richard's face went pale. You're lying. I have her signed confession. She's dying and wanted to clear her conscience. It's all here, dates, amounts, methods. Everything. For a long moment, Richard just stared at the envelope. Then, without warning, he lunged for it. Daniel jerked back, his cerebral palsy making him stumble, and Richard grabbed his arm, trying to wrench the envelope away. They struggled, and Daniel felt his grip weakening. Richard was stronger, and Daniel's left hand wasn't responding the way he needed it to. Let go. Daniel shouted. Give me that confession, and this ends peacefully. Richard hissed. Refuse, and I promise you'll regret it. Daniel kneed him in the stomach, clumsy but effective. Richard gasped and loosened his grip just enough for Daniel to break free. He ran, his uneven gait making him slow, but he had a head start. He made it to Thomas's room and pounded on the door. Thomas, help. The door opened and Thomas stood there in pajamas, looking alarmed. Daniel? What? Richard appeared behind Daniel, breathing hard but forcing his expression into concern. Uncle, I'm sorry to disturb you. I found Daniel sneaking out. When I asked where he'd been, he attacked me. That's not what happened. He has something he's trying to hide. I think we should call security. Thomas looked between them, his expression sharpening. Richard, go back to your wing. Daniel, come inside. Uncle, I really think. Now, Richard. Richard held Thomas's gaze for a moment, then left, but not before shooting Daniel a look that promised this wasn't over. Daniel stumbled into Thomas's room and closed the door, his hands shaking as he pulled out the envelope. Alice Brennan found me. She gave me this. It's a full confession of what your brother did. Thomas took the envelope and read it slowly, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he set it down carefully and sat on the edge of his bed, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. James, he whispered, my own brother. I'm sorry. Don't be. You didn't do this. You're just a messenger. Thomas looked up, his eyes hard. Richard knows, doesn't he? He found out what his father did and has been protecting that secret ever since. Alice said he's known for years. Then he's been lying to me for decades, letting me grieve, letting me visit that fake grave, all while knowing exactly where Margaret was and what had happened to her. Thomas stood, his grief hardening into anger. He'll come after you now. After both of us. This confession destroys everything he's built. What do? We call Marion first thing in the morning. We give her this confession and let her handle the legal ramifications. And we increase security immediately. Thomas picked up his phone. But tonight, you're sleeping here, on that couch. I'm not letting you out of my sight until this is settled. Daniel was too exhausted to argue. He lay down on the couch while Thomas settled back into bed. But neither of them really slept. They were both listening for footsteps, for doors opening, for any sign that Richard was making his next move. Morning came slowly. Thomas called Marion at 7, and she arrived by 8, reading Alice's confession with growing shock. This is explosive, she said. With this, we can prove fraud, prove conspiracy, possibly even bring criminal charges. But Daniel's right. This makes both of you targets. Richard has everything to lose. What do? Thomas asked. First, I make copies of this confession and store them in multiple secure locations. Second, I contact the authorities and begin the process of a formal investigation. Third, we get you both somewhere safe until this is resolved. I'm not running for my own nephew. You're not running. You're being strategic. Thomas, if something happens to you before we can formalize Daniel's claim, Richard inherits everything by default. We can't let that happen. They were still debating when Grace knocked urgently on the door. Mr. Ashford, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this. She showed them her phone. Someone had leaked the story to the press. The headline read, Billionaire's long-lost grandson or elaborate fraud. Teen claims Ashford Heir was hidden for decades. The article detailed Daniel's arrival as claims, and even included a photo of him entering the estate. It didn't name him directly, but anyone who wanted to find him could. The comments section was already vicious, split between people calling him a scammer and people demanding DNA evidence. Richard, Thomas said flatly, he's trying to poison public opinion before we can prove anything. Or he's trying to flush us out into the open, Marion said. Make it harder for us to operate quietly. Force us to defend ourselves publicly. Daniel felt sick. This was spiraling out of control. All he'd wanted was to find his grandfather, and now he was at the center of a media circus, and what was starting to feel like a war. We need to secure proof, Marion said. Something undeniable that we can present publicly. The DNA results won't be back for days, and Alice's confession could be challenged as the ravings of a dying woman. We need something concrete. What about the vault? Grace said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. I'm sorry, she said, but I've been with this family for 40 years. I know all its secrets, and I know that Thomas kept every important document related to Margaret in his private vault: birth certificates, medical records, photos, letters, everything that would prove her identity and lineage. She looked at Thomas. You showed me once, years ago, when you were organizing your affairs. You said you couldn't bear to look at them, but couldn't bear to destroy them either. Thomas's expression shifted. The vault. Of course. I'd forgotten. After the heart attack 2 years ago, I couldn't remember half my passwords. What kind of vault? Daniel asked. A private security vault in the basement, biometric access only. I had it installed 30 years ago, right after Margaret died, or right after I thought she did. Thomas looked at Daniel. If you're really my grandson, if Margaret was really your mother, then your DNA should be close enough to mine to trigger the backup recognition protocol. The vault was designed to only open for me or my direct descendants. And if it doesn't open? Richard's voice came from the doorway. He stood there with Victoria beside him, both dressed and alert despite the early hour. If his hand doesn't work on that scanner, will you finally accept that this is all a lie? Richard, Thomas said coldly, this doesn't concern you. It concerns me when my dying uncle is being manipulated by a con artist. It concerns me when our family's name is being dragged through the media. It concerns me when your lies are about to be exposed. Thomas cut him off. I know, Richard. I know what your father did. I know you've known for years and said nothing. I know you've been protecting his crime to maintain your position. Richard's mask cracked completely. My father did what was necessary. You were going to marry that woman, Elena, and she would have destroyed everything he'd built. She'd have isolated you, controlled you, pushed Margaret aside. Father was protecting you, protecting the company, protecting this family's legacy. By stealing my daughter? By making me think she was dead. By giving her a new life away from the drama. By securing the future. You think Margaret would have been happy here? She'd have been collateral damage in Elena's ambitions. Richard's voice rose. And yes, I found his records after he died. And yes, I kept a secret, because the alternative was admitting that everything we've built was founded on that decision, because the alternative was chaos. The alternative was truth, Daniel said. Richard turned on him. You have no idea what truth costs. You want to waltz in here and claim a fortune you never earned? You want to destroy my sister's future because your mother filled your head with stories? Fine. Let's settle this right now. Let's go to the vault. Let's see if you really are who you claim to be. Victoria put a hand on her brother's arm. Richard, maybe we should. No. I'm tired of waiting for DNA tests and investigations. The vault will prove it one way or another. If he's Thomas's grandson, it'll open. If he's not, he leaves today, and we never speak of this again. Thomas looked at Daniel. Are you willing? Daniel's heart was pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. If the vault opened, his claim was proven. If it didn't, he didn't know what would happen. Yes, he said. Let's do it. They made their way to the basement, a strange procession. Thomas, Daniel, Marion, Grace, Richard, and Victoria. The vault was hidden behind a false wall, in what looked like a wine cellar. Thomas pressed a panel, and the wall slid aside, revealing a heavy steel door with a biometric scanner. How does it work? Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Place your right hand on the scanner, Thomas said. It reads your DNA signature through your skin. If you're my direct descendant, the genetic markers should match closely enough to trigger the release. And if I'm not, then it stays locked, and we all have our answer. Daniel approached the vault, aware of everyone watching. Richard stood with his arms crossed, confident this would fail. Victoria looked nervous. Marion was recording everything on her phone. Grace watched with something like hope. Thomas stood beside Daniel. Whatever happens, you tried. You followed your mother's wishes. That took courage. Daniel nodded, unable to speak. He placed his trembling right hand on the scanner. The device hummed to life, blue light scanning his palm, his fingers, reading something invisible in his cells. The seconds stretched impossibly long. Then, with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room, the vault door began to open. Richard's face went white. Victoria gasped. Grace started crying. Thomas reached out and gripped Daniel's shoulder, his own hand shaking. The vault swung open, revealing shelves lined with document boxes, photo albums, and a small wooden box that Daniel somehow knew had been important to his mother. "It worked," Marion said, her voice thick with emotion. "The vault accepted him. That's genetic proof. He's Thomas's direct descendant." Richard staggered back, his world crumbling. "That's not possible. The scanner could be malfunctioning." "It could be." "It's not malfunctioning," Thomas said quietly. "He's my grandson, Richard. He's Margaret's son. And that means everything you've built your life on is a lie." Daniel stepped into the vault on shaking legs. The boxes contained everything: birth certificates, hospital records, school photos, report cards. His mother's entire childhood, preserved like a shrine. He opened the wooden box and found the music box with the blue bird, just as she described. When he turned the key, it played a soft lullaby. "She remembered this song," Daniel whispered. "She used to hum it when she was sad. She said it reminded her of being small and safe." Thomas moved beside him, tears streaming down his face. He picked up one of the photo albums and opened it, showing Daniel pictures of a laughing little girl with Thomas's blue eyes and Daniel's stubborn chin. "That's her," Thomas said. "That's my Margaret. And that's you in her eyes, in her smile. I see it now. I should have seen it from the beginning." They stood there together, grandfather and grandson, surrounded by the evidence of a life stolen and a truth finally revealed. Behind them, Richard slid down the wall, his head in his hands. Victoria knelt beside him, her own face wet with tears. Grace called the authorities, and Marion began photographing everything in the vault for legal documentation. It took hours to go through it all. They found Margaret's original birth certificate, her medical records showing her blood type, and genetic markers that could be matched to Daniel's, letters she'd written to her father that had never been sent, drawings and school projects, and a diary that ended the day she disappeared. They also found something else, a letter from James Ashford to Thomas, dated a week after Margaret's death, expressing his condolences and suggesting changes to the estate planning. The handwriting was shaky, the tone false, and knowing what they knew now, the manipulation was obvious. "He comforted you while knowing exactly what he'd done," Marion said. "That's sociopathic." "James was always ruthless in business," Thomas said. "But I never thought. He was my brother. I trusted him. And he used that trust to commit fraud and destroy a child's life," Marion said. She turned to Richard. "You have two choices. You can cooperate with the investigation, provide evidence of what your father did, and potentially avoid criminal charges. Or you can continue to obstruct, and I'll make sure the prosecutor throws every possible charge at you." Richard looked up, his face haggard. "I didn't hurt anyone. I just didn't tell the truth." "You conspired to maintain a fraud. You obstructed Daniel's claim. You threatened both Thomas and Daniel. That's enough for multiple felonies." Victoria stood. "I'll testify. About what my father did. About what Richard knew. All of it. I won't protect lies anymore." Richard looked at his sister with betrayal. "Victoria." "No. This is wrong, Richard. It was always wrong. Margaret deserved better. Daniel deserves better. And Uncle Thomas deserves to know his daughter loved him until the day she died." She turned to Daniel. "I'm sorry. For my father, for my brother, for all of it. You should have grown up here, in this family. Instead, you got poverty and foster care and a mother who died too young. That's not fair, and I won't defend it." The police arrived an hour later. They took statements, photographed the vault and its contents, and confiscated Alice's confession. Richard was questioned extensively and eventually agreed to provide evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence. The investigation that followed would take months, but the core truth was already established. Daniel was Thomas Ashford's grandson. Margaret Ashford had been hidden, not killed. and the family that had benefited from that lie would now face the consequences. The media storm was intense. The DNA results came back a week later, confirming with 99.9% certainty that Daniel was Thomas's biological grandson. The story made national news. Billionaire's lost heir found after 34 years. Family conspiracy exposed. Teen overcomes disability to claim rightful inheritance. Daniel hated the attention. He gave one carefully prepared statement with Marion's help, explaining that he'd only wanted to find his grandfather and honor his mother's memory. He didn't mention the money, didn't gloat about the vault or the proof. He just asked for privacy while the family healed. Thomas formally amended his will, naming Daniel as his primary heir and establishing trusts to ensure Daniel's future. Victoria would still inherit a substantial portion. She'd proven her integrity, and Thomas felt she deserved recognition for that. Richard was written out completely. Richard eventually pled guilty to fraud and obstruction charges. He received a suspended sentence and probation, but his reputation was destroyed. He moved away, and Daniel heard he was living quietly in another state, trying to rebuild his life away from the Ashford name. Victoria stayed. She and Daniel developed a cautious friendship, not quite siblings, but family nonetheless. She taught him about the business, about the responsibilities that came with wealth, about how to use resources to actually help people rather than just accumulate more. Grace became like a grandmother to Daniel. She'd known his mother as a child, and she shared stories that Daniel treasured. Little details about Margaret's favorite foods, her fear of thunderstorms, the way she'd sing to herself when she thought no one was listening. Marion ensured that Daniel's transition into the family was legally sound and protected. She became his advocate and eventually his friend. And Thomas made up for lost time in every way he could. He was careful not to overwhelm Daniel, not to try to replace his mother or pretend the past hadn't happened. Instead, he simply offered what Daniel had been searching for, a place to belong. They spent evenings in the study, Daniel doing homework while Thomas read, occasionally looking up to share a thought or ask a question. They had dinner together most nights, usually just the two of them, talking about everything and nothing. They visited Margaret's actual grave. Thomas had her remains moved from the false plot to a beautiful spot overlooking the ocean, where they could visit together and tell her about the life she'd made possible for her son. 6 months after Daniel first arrived at the estate, Thomas took him sailing. It was something he'd done with Margaret, and something he'd thought he'd never do again. Daniel wasn't naturally athletic, and his cerebral palsy made the balance challenging, but Thomas was patient, and Daniel was determined. "Your mother loved this," Thomas said as they glided across the water. "She used to say the ocean was the only place where all the rules were different, where being small didn't matter because everyone was small compared to the sea. She told me the ocean was constant," Daniel said, "that no matter what changed on land, the ocean was always there, always the same. It made her feel like some things were permanent. She was wiser than I gave her credit for." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I spent 30 years thinking I'd failed her, that I should have protected her better, should have known something was wrong, should have searched harder. Your arrival didn't erase that guilt, but it gave me a chance to try again, to be the grandfather she wanted me to be. You're doing pretty well so far." Thomas smiled. "You're generous with your assessment." "You showed up," Daniel said simply. "When I had nowhere else to go, when I was just some kid with a story, you listened. You believed me when no one else would. That matters. Your mother taught you kindness. That's her real legacy, not the money or the estate, but the value she instilled in you despite everything she went through." They sailed for another hour, not talking much, just existing together in the space Margaret had loved. When they returned to shore, Daniel realized he wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Richard, not of the future, not of being alone. He'd found what he'd been searching for, not just family or wealth or proof, but a place where he belonged, where his mother's memory was honored, where the truth she'd hidden could finally be told. That evening, as Daniel sat in his room looking at a photo of his mother, young and smiling, before everything had gone wrong, he realized something important. She'd sent him here not just to find his grandfather, but to give them both a chance at healing. She'd known the truth would be painful, that exposing it would cause damage, but she'd also known it was necessary. Sometimes love meant telling the truth, even when that truth was difficult. Sometimes it meant risking everything to give someone else a chance at something better. His mother had done that for him, and now, finally, he could honor that gift by building the life she'd wanted him to have. What would you have done in Daniel's place? Walked away from the fight, or pushed through despite the danger? Drop your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, consider subscribing. There are more untold stories waiting to be discovered.